Howdy everyone, welcome back to Amateur Philosopher. In this week's episode, we are going to be talking about the fine-tuning argument. And in my previous video, I mentioned that my second video, that being this one, that we would cover objections to the fine-tuning argument. But instead I've decided to first outline the argument, what it actually is, and we will discuss the objections to it that I find most interesting, most relevant in the next video. The reason I'm doing this is because it's a little bit pointless to know the objections to an argument that you're not really intimately familiar with. So that's what I intend to accomplish in this video. So what is the fine-tuning argument? Well, first it's important to understand what fine-tuning itself actually is. Fine-tuning is a way physicists describe a phenomena in which the constants of the universe have very delicately balanced values, to where if you were to make very minor adjustments to those values, then the universe can no longer be life permitting. And it's often called the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life, for life. And some examples include the rate of expansion of the universe. So the universe is expanding at a constant rate. And if you were to adjust the rate of expansion by just 1 part in 10 to the 120th power, and what that means is, you know how a ruler has a bunch of increments? Well, imagine if it had 10 to the 120th power increments, which is like a billion, 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 billion. It's a super large number. So if you had a ruler that long and the expansion rate holds a value on one of those tiny, tiny little increments, it's that precise. If you were to adjust it in either direction by just one of those tiny increments, then you wind up with a universe that cannot permit life of any kind. And that's a very important distinction to make, because a lot of people, I think, have a misunderstanding about what fine-tuning is actually saying. A lot of people will say, well, you know, human life couldn't exist, but maybe some other life would have developed. The kind of fine-tuning examples that we'll look at, like the mass of an electron, the rate of expansion, critical density of the universe, these values, and I believe there's about a dozen or so of these super finely tuned values, according to Leonard Susskind. I'm citing his interview with Robert Kuhn on the Closer to Truth YouTube channel. So, fact checkers, fact check me, bruh. He says there's about a dozen of those constants that are finely tuned. So these kind of adjustments to these constants, if you were to tweak them ever so slightly, you get the kinds of universes that are devoid of planets, stars, chemistry. So not only can you not get human life, but you can't get life of any kind. And abiogenesis, the field of research that looks at, you know, the origins of life and how life eventually started, you know, and started from single-celled organisms and developed and evolved over time. That field, you know, there's still a wide lot of research that needs to be done in that area. Like they are not sure how life originated. Of course, there are ideas, but my point there is not that like, oh, you know, God's the answer for the origin of life just because we can't answer it. I'm saying that even if they are able to uncover that, the fine-tuning is talking about the necessary conditions for things like chemistry and planets. So not to beat a dead horse there, but I will say this is probably the best argument for God from scientific findings, in my opinion. And the way the formal argument usually is structured goes something like this. I want to apologize for not having a PowerPoint slide. I plan on learning some of that this week, so that my next few videos can be a little more organized and neat. But the formal argument looks something like this. You'll have the first premise, which is that the universe is fine-tuned either because of necessity, chance, or design. Premise 2, the fine-tuning is not due to necessity or chance. And the conclusion is that, therefore, it is due to design. Now, of course, lots of people are unhappy with this argument. To me, it's logically sound if those first two premises are true, so people want to debate the truth of the premises. And they've gone about it in a variety of ways, but we're going to cover, in the next video, we're going to look at 5 objections to the fine-tuning argument for God. And the first one is the anthropic principle, which basically says, like, you guys shouldn't be surprised that life exists in a universe where the conditions are right for life to exist. That's not surprising. There's a famous puddle analogy where people are like, that's like a puddle on the ground saying, like, this world around me just happens to fit me so perfectly. Like, it must have been made for me. So that's a very common objection worth addressing. The second objection we're going to be looking at is the God doesn't need to fine-tune anything argument, which is basically saying, if God's omnipotent, then him needing to constrain himself in his creation by finding very particular values of these constants indicates that he's limited, and so he's not actually omnipotent. I don't see how that follows at all, but we'll talk more in detail about that next time. The third is that God would need to be even more finely tuned. God would need to be even more finely tuned than the universe that he creates. So this is basically just kicking the fine-tuning problem up a level. And this is actually the objection David Deutsch mentioned. He's a physicist in his interview with Robert Kuhn on the Closer to Truth YouTube channel, which I highly recommend you check out. Have lots of very fascinating videos about not only this, but about like consciousness and cosmology and all kinds of interesting things. So those are the first 3 objections. Number 4 is going to be the multiverse theory, which basically states that there are an infinite number of universes. And so if you have an infinite number of universes, you're guaranteed to get at least one that's life permitting, right? I mean, the odds are any possible outcome is going to be eventually realized. That's the argument anyway. And then lastly, we'll talk about this objection that it basically can be summarized by saying, most of the universe is not hospitable towards life. You guys are very arrogant if you go around claiming, oh, look at the fine-tuning of the universe for life, when it appears that most of the universe is like 99.9% fine-tuned for rocks and stuff, right? So we'll talk about that, and hopefully I'll be able to cover all 5 objections in less than 10 minutes. I'd like to try and keep these videos pretty brief, except for maybe interviews, debates, which I hope to do in the future. But for the most part, yeah, I'm going to try and keep these pretty concise. So guys, I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope you have a clear understanding of what the fine-tuning phenomena is in physics, and I hope you understand what the argument is saying. We'll talk more in detail about objections in next week's video, and until then, take care.